Just because microgreens are an easy business to start doesn't mean that they're the right business for you. Today, it's all about the many, many, many reasons why microgreens might not be a fit for you. Stay tuned for that coming up. Welcome to the Growing Microgreens podcast. I'm your host, Diego, D-I-E-G-O. This is a show all about how to grow microgreens successfully. In each episode, grower Chris Thoreau will share 10 plus years of microgreen experience, giving insights for people who operate or want to operate a profitable microgreens business. As we go through this series, if you want to learn more from Chris, check out his online course using the link in the description below. Today's episode is one that is intentionally contrary, because so much of the talk out there is about why microgreens are so great. And they are great for a lot of reasons. I've done a ton of episodes on microgreens talking about why they are a great business. But there are many reasons why they aren't a great business. And that's what this episode's about. I really want to make this episode because the danger of a great business on paper is everybody thinks they can do it and everybody wants to do it. And what are the odds that that business is right for everybody who wants to do it? Pretty darn low. So in this episode, grower Chris Thoreau and I, someone who's been growing microgreens for 12 plus years, are going to talk about the many reasons why they might not be a fit for you. If you're all excited about microgreens or you're on the fence about microgreens, listen to this one first. So Chris, we're back recording episodes on microgreens here for 2019. And while we've done, I think, somewhere between 15 and 20 episodes in the past talking about all the ways to succeed with a microgreens business, today is a little bit different. And success is measured by not starting a microgreen business, because that's the focus of this episode, why you shouldn't start a microgreen business, or who is a microgreen business not for. And you've had a lot of experience talking to a lot of growers over the years in consults, and you had a lot of experience doing it. So you've seen both sides, the actual doing it, and then people who want to do it and start and keep going, and people who start and stop. What are some of your experiences been with people that it isn't a fit for?
Yeah, so I really do like the theme of this episode, because we do push the reasons to do it, and I don't think we need to push those reasons because people are already aware of that. And so I do sort of cycle back and think about consults I've done or conversations I've had with people who are interested in microgreens. They're very enthusiastic. And then we start getting into certain aspects of it. And what I notice is just a little bit of a shift in the conversation. And I'm recalling one consult where I just remember the guy going, oh, and he just sort of had this reality check. And what it was in that case was he wanted to start a microgreens business. He wanted to run it out of his home. He wanted to bring his parents in to help because they were retiring and it seemed like a good thing that would work for the family. And then as we talked about scale and things and how it would look, we got into this idea that, well, your home is now going to become your work site. And as your business grows, you're going to have piles of compost. You're going to have visitors to your home. You're going to have employees in your home space all the time. And what that means is you're going to lose that place you can go to get away from work. Our home is where we want to rest and get away and be ourselves and entertain guests. And sometimes if your business is too embedded in your home, you can't have that space. And in this conversation, it really stood out for this guy. He's like, yeah, I don't want employees here. If our business grows, we're definitely going to need to hire people. He didn't want to be doing the grunt work. And really, I think he really thought about it, talked more with his family, and I don't think they ever did pursue it. And it wasn't an effort on my part to talk him out of it. It was just more a reality check about how this approach to microgreens would affect his life. And so, yeah, it's one of those things you need to consider about when you do this. What does it mean for your lifestyle, your daily flow, your home life, and things like that? So, yeah, so like number one on my list of reasons not to grow microgreens or reasons not to grow.
Let me pause you there. Before we get to that. And I think it's important to see this whole picture because I think people come in seeing the picture they want to see. And that's always rosy and optimistic with anything that we do, hobbies that we take on, we buy a new home. Once we kind of fall in love with the idea, we find all the supporting facts of why we should do it, and we never look at the reasons why we shouldn't. So this episode will hopefully counterbalance a lot of the episodes of why you should. And just from your discussions with people who want to get into it, can you throw a bullet point list out there of generally why people want to get into microgreens, and then hit me up with your first reason why you think it might not be a fit?
Yeah, so the reasons to get into microgreens, and it's different for different people at different points in their life, but things I think you hear often are someone wants a change in their life. They're in a job they don't like. They're maybe making good money, not satisfied. They've been paying attention to this food movement. They understand the importance of food. They're maybe intimidated or just don't see the possibility of having land, which is what we think of when we think of food production. But when you think of something like microgreens, where you can grow a lot of revenue in a small space, it's like, oh, like here's a way I could be involved in this fulfilling world of food growing without having acres of land, or do it from home or something like that. So part of it is, yeah, like making a life change and seeing microgreens as a feasible way to do that in the food world. A lot of people are drawn to it because of the health benefits of microgreens. Some people see it as something that benefits them and benefits others. So what they're doing is they're starting a business that's really values-based and ethics-based. And so I think they feel they can make money, but they're making money doing something they believe in. And so that feels very good to them. And then another big one is that people see the value of microgreens. You see trays valued from $20 to $30 to $50 a tray, and people start doing the math, and they're like, oh, like, boy, if I grew 100 trays a week, that doesn't take up a lot of space. That's $5,000 a week in sales. They start doing the math, and they often do the math on the revenue end and not on the expenditures end, and so there's some gaps there. So that's a third reason. And I'd say the fourth is actually existing food growers, so farmers usually at a small to mid scale, who want to add microgreens to their production system. One, as a way of diversifying what they're growing for crops, but two, as a way of extending their season, often allowing them to get some more shoulder season crops when a lot of their stuff is not quite matured or past maturity. So yeah, I think those are the things that stand out the most. And then as people get into it, there is this idea that there's a really quick, what I call the sort of a seed to sale cycle. If you're growing a lot of crops, it takes 30, 60, 120, 150 days before you sell that crop, and then maybe another 30 days often before you get paid. Whereas with microgreens, you could have a 7-day crop, take it to the farmer's market, and get cash on day 8. And so there's these aspects of it that are appealing in that way. Yeah, so those are the things that stand out for me the most.
Yeah, so a lot of good reasons, all great reasons that people can rally behind and use to say, I want to do this. Now we start peeling back the onion and say, okay, let's test your belief in those reasons and how much you really want to do this. How attractive is that money really? What's one reason why somebody might not want to, despite those things?
So I think the example I gave is like a lot of people, so many people I talk to actually really want to do this production system from home. They're not thinking about renting a warehouse somewhere or building a greenhouse. They see doing it from their home, and the appeal for that is they're already paying rent or a mortgage, and so they want to capitalize on that and use that space to generate revenue. So there's part of it is there is that that business now really encroaches on your home life and can become invasive. Now, for some people, maybe that's fine. Your home is set up in a way, or your personality is such that that's totally fine. And I did it for a winter in my bloody apartment, without problem. I couldn't have done it for, a year. I can tell you that. So that's part of it. The other thing is, if your whole business model is based on building a microgreens business just in your home, that eventually it's not so much that it's going to fail, it's that it's going to get shut down. Your home in general is not, in the eyes of most municipal health authorities, the home is not a suitable place to grow food for production. And some people can set it up. So, you could bring a chef or the health inspector by and they would go, yeah, great. You've got a designated separated room. You've got drainage in the floor. You've got stainless steel. Like you've done a really good job here. Everything's separated from your life. That's probably exceptional case. For most people, no matter how well they do their setup, it's not something that could really be explicit. So I think when looking at it as a home-based business, it's not like making jewelry or pottery out of a room in your house. It's a very different thing. And again, the part of it is we're dealing with food. Food is, there's a lot of attention to food these days to make sure food is safe and clean and does not make you sick or, God forbid, kill somebody. And it happens all the time. And even with really good systems in place. And so that's where the health authorities, allow certain things to happen in the household, and other things they require more strict environments. So yeah, that the use of home space is a limiting factor. And if that's your business model, chances are it's not going to work. You have to be able to use the home as your prototyping area, learning how to do things, growing for yourself and maybe some friends. But if you're going to make a bona fide business out of it, you're going to need to go into a greenhouse, a warehouse, some other growing space that is separate from your living environment.
I think it's a great point. And we've done consult episodes where people have struggled with this. They're doing it in one space in their house and it's just not really optimum, and they want to go someplace else and they're struggling at this step. And I think, you listen to a lot of books, podcasts, a lot of home startups, side hustle things start out of a home office because it's easy, it's convenient. You don't have cost associated with that. And I think you're right. That is a great place to prototype, get the business going, kickstart things. But then where I think newbies in particular fall short is, okay, this works for 10 trays. What do I do when I'm at 100? Where is this going to be? Or all the other things. Yes, this is my growing space, but where am I putting all the soil when I'm done with it? Where am I putting all the soil that I'm going to need? Where am I going to wash trays? 10 trays in the kitchen sink, not a big deal. 100 trays in the kitchen sink, a big deal. Or their partner in the beginning is very accommodating, like, I support you, go for it, let's do this. They're not going to tell you no. And they might not love it, but when it starts getting bigger and kind of like a virus taking over more and more of the living space that used to be the living room and dirt's everywhere, then I think it creates potential relationship issues in addition to all the business issues and health-related issues that you talked about. So I think this idea of scaling and thinking about, okay, what do I want to do with the business, trying to apply that to your home base is critical from day one. And maybe the solution is, I'm going to start in my kitchen, but then I'm going to get a structure in the backyard, a cheap greenhouse. I visited Drew Sample in Columbus, Ohio, Capital City Greens. He starts his seeds in his basement and he does winter growing there, but his main production area is a fairly inexpensive. I think it's like a $500 greenhouse in his backyard. And he has a small urban lot. It works great for him, but it does take it from a inside environment to an outside environment, which manages some of those challenges that you talked about if you are doing it in your living space, right? And then if you have pets, it's even worse.
Yeah, and the other thing, I'm glad you brought up the partner issue, because I know that's definitely something that can be a problem for sure. In the beginning, it's fine, and then it's like, oh my God, this is taking over our home. The other thing is, one of the things we're doing when we're growing microgreens is we're creating this I want to call it like an atmospheric environment. We're adding into the environment in our room a lot more moisture, for example. And so I've definitely seen in growing spaces where you don't have good ventilation, you're watering your crops, they're transpiring, so you get more humidity in the room, so your risk of mold and damage to your home actually increases as well. And that's the sort of classic example of this is marijuana grow ops, where homes get really permanently damaged because of the moisture and humidity from that. And microgreens you can control a bit better. They're usually not that scale, but I've definitely seen mold in different systems because of the microgreens. So yeah, there's challenges there, and that's why. I'm mindful not to push this too much, but this is why we have these regulations and these protocols for producing food, because just over time we've learned like certain environments don't work, certain materials don't work. Drywall is not a food safe material. It's not an ideal material when you've got lots of moisture around. And yeah, maybe you can wash trays in your kitchen sink, but what else have you washed in your kitchen sink? And are you actually, are you sanitizing that area like you might a commercial kitchen? I think what happens is it just becomes a part of our home life. We don't keep that standard that needs to happen when we sell food to the public. And I don't think we need to be neurotic about that, but I think we need to be consistent, particular, and have good attention to detail. And that's going to slip in the home. In a designated workspace, you're more likely to stay on task, I think.
Yeah, and one other thing I think of when you have a grow area is lighting, and more people are going to LEDs. And if you have grow light LEDs in your house, it's terrible. Like those lights to be around, if you're not wearing the glasses, it's not something you want to sit and enjoy. You're not reading under those lights. It's actually a harsh light, and people got to think, if I'm going to use lights on these plants, what is that lighting? Is that in an area where I need to function to live? If so, then you may be having to look at different lighting options or a different location.
Well, yeah, and I can speak to that from current experience. I've got a setup in my kitchen. I can grow 2 trays at a time. I'm just using regular fluorescents. I got 2-foot bulbs, but the light spectrum we want for microgreens is high in the blue spectrum, and the blue spectrum is super stimulating. And I've had to sort of create a little bit of a barrier that prevents the light from shining out too much, because I find it too much. And that's just with regular fluorescence. So yeah, it is definitely one of those things that impacts you.
And your number one reason ties very well into my number one reason, and mine aren't in any order here. These are just 3 reasons I came up with. And that is, you are not the person who can be a production professional, i.e. scientist and or lab tech. And through a lot of my conversations with you, I've advanced a lot in my thinking of how microgreens should be grown, how they should be treated as a food product, and how important food safety is. And that is not everybody. And we all know farmers that just don't have a lot of attention to detail when it comes to cleanliness or precision. They're clunky. It's not everybody. But if you want to do this as a microgreen grower professionally, I think you have to be that person who is the scientist or lab tech, or you have to partner with somebody or hire somebody who is. You're growing a lot of times in a closed environment. You're dealing with airflow. You're dealing with moisture conditions like you talked about, potential mold issues. You have to be systematic in how you handle all those environmental factors, temperature. How do you troubleshoot issues? You're trying to optimize the growing of crops, where a lot of field crops, you're fertilizing, you're planting, you're getting your timing right. It's good. But with microgreens in a closed environment, you've talked about this a lot. Basil has issues, or this crop has issues. What's causing those issues? How do you optimize growth in your environment for basil, which is a tropical plant, and a brassica, which can handle colder climates? Optimizing those, very scientific process. Food safety, which you mentioned, having just the wherewithal to think, okay, how is my space set up? What materials am I using? how am I treating it? I just have this image of, like you said, you walk around like you're a doctor on TV, hands up, I'm not touching other stuff. I'm washing my hands. Not everybody inherently thinks that way. And then just a high attention to detail. There's so many little things I think that can make a difference of, you add a little bit more coir to your soil. How does that change things? You back off on the coir. You water twice a day versus once a day. How much can you let your sunflowers droop? All those visuals and note taking. Like, you are a scientist. And I imagine this is how a professional cannabis grower is. Like, if you're doing well, you have to be that scientist. And I think you go a little bit above farmer, or you kind of elevate farmer to scientist there, from just somebody who's planting something and kind of letting nature run its course. So my number one reason is, you don't want to be that professional. You don't want to be that scientist or lab tech.
Yeah, so I have on my list here as well, just this basic point, attention to detail. So I'm gonna backstep a little bit, and I know we've talked about food safety and sanitation and hygiene a lot. I really think it's important, but it's been a struggle for me, because my journey into food, and I think a lot of people's journey into food, is from an activist perspective. I won't get into the socio-economical and socio-political aspects of food and seed, but it's very complicated in modern days, right? We have very big food companies that have a huge amount of control over specific food products or seed or distribution or whatever it is. And people are drawn to small scale systems because there's a sense of control there. There's a sense of activism. And often with that sense of activism is, you're not going to tell me what to do. I don't want to follow the system. I want to be independent. And that's great if you're homesteading. That's great if you're doing something for yourself. And it really is. But it changes when you make the shift and start selling food to the public. And when I had grown microgreens a little when I was farming, and I kind of paid attention to that stuff, but it was just another crop. And then when I really started looking at it as an urban business, really intensive, I did it as a directed studies project at university. And when I started reading about it, I'm like, oh, like there's so many rules and steps to follow. And I was actually quite turned off for a while. And then I'm like, okay, well, no, like, you read rules and they seem prohibitive, but what I need to do is just understand these rules to get a sense of how I do this at the small scale, so it can still be an activist activity. And there's really nothing inherently wrong with washing your hands a lot. Like, there's no selling out in washing your hands a lot. There's no selling out in making sure your growing system stays clean and you're bringing in clean soil and you're testing for pathogens. Like, that is self-care, and that is care for the community of people that you're growing food for. And so that attention to detail, a lot of it is around food safety and all these little steps you need to take, which unfortunately often correspond with increasing costs. And so the proposal, the vision starts to fall apart when you're starting to chip away at that $30 a price, $30 a tray price, because you have all these expenses to do with, all these issues. And so, you have to really like crossing your T's and dotting your I's and keeping an eye on everything. And I'll step back again. You don't need to be neurotic about that stuff. I am not an attention to detail person. My home life and the way I manage things in my general life is nothing like I did my microgreens operation. I really learned attention to detail through doing it. So it's a shift that you can make. And I think once you start to look at it through a different lens, as opposed to like repetitive tasks or all these hoops or these, external demands I need to meet, you start to take pride in how you run your operation, just like you might take pride in how you run your restaurant by keeping it super clean, by, having really nice lighting, by having really good music, whatever it is. These are all attention to detail that really get noticed with your end product and with the consumer experience. So, I mentioned earlier, I'd done a consult for Javin, who you've had on the program many times, and a buddy of his, and we had a great time. And we spent a weekend together, went over a lot of stuff. They wanted to start up an operation in Victoria. They got things going. Things were they were growing good. Sales were good. they're just like, yeah, after a while, not even, it was even a few months, they're like, yeah, it's not what we like to do. The flow isn't right. It's a lot of repetitive tasks. It's great. It's a great model. We've been able to pass it on to someone else, but yeah, we didn't think about this and we didn't think about that. And so it's one of the reasons why in a consult, I'm often saying, like, here's a few things to think about. Because I don't want someone to spend a bunch of time and money and then realize, oh, yeah, I just don't like doing X, Y, and Z. And there's a lot of X, Y, and Z in this type of business.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And I think, you coming from the activist route into it, I mean, you have some perspective into this. This is my observation. A lot of people, they come in as activists. They generally have, and I'm stereotyping people, a more free spirit. Like they're kind of artsier. They're not as precise. Like most activists aren't lab techs, or they're not working in a clean room, or they're not computer programmers. Their mind works a little differently. And I think from my experience talking to so many farmers, like that's kind of how they come. They come in via the homesteading route. And when you're doing that, you're like, I just want freedom. I want to raise my own food. You are coming at it from the lifestyle, the sense of independence. Maybe you do want to contribute to change in the food system. Like that's the first and foremost thing. And those are all great things. And then that attention to detail, especially around food safety, I think gets lost. And if you start to factor in food safety costs to a startup of like a microgreens operation, suddenly something that costs not a lot of money to start gets a little more realistically expensive. Because if I'm just going to start on my kitchen table with a few trays, some soil, some seed growing, that's one thing. But now if I get a stainless steel wash sink, some stainless steel tables to prep everything on, adequate sanitizers, that's more expensive. You're buying small infrastructure to do this. And I think when people start up, they look at that stuff like, oh, that's expensive. Like I got to buy a stainless steel table or a stainless steel sink. I'll just go with something else for right now, plastic tub. And that's how they start. And maybe that works in certain scenarios. But eventually, depending on how big you want to go, I think you do need to move past that.
You do. And I think, I actually think it's important that as long as you have that awareness of that, yeah, you probably want to start off with, a plastic this or a rubber that, and then graduate into stainless steel or whatever you need to do. One of the reasons is, maybe if you've got the capital, you can buy all that stuff in the beginning, and that's totally fine. That's great if you can do that. Some people have the money. They're good at organizing these things. They take do a bit of training. They buy what they need in the beginning, and they're off. I didn't have the capital to do that in the beginning, but I knew it was something I would work toward. So I developed the system using, what I thought were good enough materials. But then I could improve my materials because I was generating revenue, and I was generating my own capital. So then you graduate from coroplast benchtops to stainless steel benchtops. And it does seem like this big expense, but that's the only benchtop you're going to need ever again. And with the coroplast one, you're going to replace it every few years, and that's going to take time, and that's going to take money. And the amount of time and money that takes is kind of hidden in the cost. So with the stainless steel, like it's going to be easier to clean. You're not going to have to change it ever. So these things do pay for themselves over time, and in the end become less expensive. And it's really, really hard to see that, and especially if you don't have the capital to make those investments. But yeah, you do need to be aware of those things and the costs that come with doing a good job.
Yeah, like big farms have to do this. You grow 1,000 acres of lettuce, like you have a food safety program in place. People are wearing gloves. There's hand wash stations. There's signage up. And I think one quick test is like, small farms. I mean, do you have a designated hand wash station? And I don't think a lot of farms do.
Yeah, I do see a lot of things that I'm surprised to see, because I do think basic food hygiene is very, very, very important. I kind of want to go back to, you kind of mentioned this idea like activists are really free thinkers, and part of what I think of in that way is they're creative as well, and they want to find creative solutions. And in that way, this kind of venture is really interesting because, yeah, you look at all the stuff we're talking about, like, stainless steel this and this monitor and this sensor and this test and there's often the status quo for what you do, but then there's like, well, what if we did it this way? And you sort of contemplate it. It's like, yeah, like I could buy this greenhouse sensor and this device, but they cost $8,000. And what if I just get this from Home Depot and this from Canadian Tire? I think it'll do the same thing because you want to have the infrastructure that's appropriate for your scale. And there's not a lot of specific infrastructure for small scale stuff. It's often for bigger scale operations, like big greenhouses, big warehouses. So the appealing thing, I think, and I think this was what, from my activist point of view, which in a way was subdued because I developed the business partially through academia, was to find like creative solutions to something that would typically be daunting. And so, if you're, all the stuff you mentioned earlier when you're talking about, having to be well organized and attention to detail and adjusting things, like the way I would summarize that is you have to have the entrepreneurial spirit. You have to have the drive to know you're going to come up with problems. You're going to run into barriers. You're going to run into complications, and you need to see them just as that. Just as a barrier isn't a stop point. It's just something that's in the way, and you need to find ways to get over it. And so I definitely notice this amongst my friends. Like some of us are really entrepreneurial and love to do stuff and take risks and try things. And other people, the idea of starting their own business or developing something and marketing it on their own, it just doesn't fall in the realm of possibility. They work, collect a paycheck, and stay home on the weekends. And so it's good to know what your mindset is, what your ability to take risk is in terms of going into something like this as well.
Yeah, along mindset, my number 2 reason is you aren't okay doing a lot of the same thing over and over and over and over. A few months ago, I visited Closed Loop Farms in Chicago. They do something like 500 trays of micros a week. And I was talking to their owner, Adam, and I was like, how much time do you spend like filling trays? And I believe he said a number, it was like 40 plus hours a week of just labor filling trays or washing trays. It was something along those lines. I mean, I think it might have been washing trays. But that was one person's job. Basically, all they did is wash trays. And at some scale, all these little things get old, I imagine, really quick. Like I think about, I seeded some crops this weekend, like 4 trays. And I'm like, by the 4th tray, I'm like, I'm kind of done with this. I got other things I want to do. I can't imagine doing 100. And when you have quick crop turnarounds and you're seeding multiple times a week, depending on the size of the business, like if you're not into harvesting, if you're not into washing trays, if you're not into filling trays, then this is not the business for you.
Yeah, so number 2 on my list is also repetitive tasks. Funnily enough, but here's the thing, and I know I shouldn't be playing devil's advocate, but I cannot stand repetitive tasks. Somehow, doing this work because it was my venture, I could and I have filled tens of thousands of trays with soil, and I was even by the food peddler site the other day, and I'm not working with them anymore, but I was just, I'll fill some trays, and I didn't have this sense of dread or like, oh my God, I hate this. It was like this thing, but there's some things I did not like to do. There were certain crops I just didn't like to seed. The flow was never there. There were certain days I just didn't want to wash trays. I just had a follow-up from a consult I did. He's like, I'm spending 5 hours a week washing trays. Like, what's going on? I'm like, oh, that sounds about right. So it's this thing, and there's ways to make it a little quicker for sure, and a lot of those things quicker. But yeah, like if you can't stand doing things over and over again in a day, in a week, it will drive you batty. And the thing is, you have to do those tasks in a very specific way. It's really important that, you're filling the trays really well with soil, not just throwing a bunch of soil to get it done, because you start to notice when somebody's rushing or somebody's not seeding something properly. And so if you're not good at repetitive tasks and also tend to rush during repetitive tasks, you're going to end up shooting yourself in the foot. So it's one to watch out for. And, looking a little further ahead, this has got to be a question you ask somebody when you interview them for a position. Like, you're going to do the same thing over and over again, and you're going to do the stuff that I don't like to do because I've had enough. How are you with that? And you can learn a lot about yourself in that process.
Oh, I bet. And my sub bullet to this is, you're not that into microgreens or the business. And I thought a lot about this. If you enjoy the business and you're really interested and intrigued by growing the business and the idea of microgreens, I think that's where you are, and you can take doing those repetitive tasks. But if I was like, okay, Chris, for 4 hours a day, you just got to put marbles in these jars and you're just going to get paid to do it, you might get over it. Like, I've packed thousands of boxes this year. Anybody who's ordered anything from PaperPot, I have put it in a box. And when I think about going to work for somebody to pack boxes, hell no. Yet I pack boxes 5 days a week. But it's a business that's working. I enjoy the greater part of the business, so I embrace the parts of the business that aren't as glorious. And I think if you like it, you'll do these ugly tasks when they have to be done. And eventually you outsource them and you get sick of them, but you'll do them. Where if you don't like the business to begin with, like if you convinced yourself to get into it for the money or whatever else, and now you're doing these ugly tasks, that's not going to last. Like, you're going to tap out and it's going to be over really quick.
Yeah, no, those are really good points. I think in any business, you're going to do grunt work in the beginning. And I really had that in mind in my first several years of doing the microgreens, because at that point, and that's going, my first year of production was 2009, like my first getting into commercial production. And there wasn't a lot of resources out there for developing systems. So I was really figuring that stuff out along the way. And that's what was enjoyable about it. And I learned this process about myself, and I think about people in general. I'd be setting up the system. I'd work a lot of stuff out in my head. I'd set it up, and then I would start washing trays. And I'm like, oh, like I'm picking up this tray 5 different times to wash it. I need a system where I pick it up once and then it, maybe twice. And so the developing of those systems to making them really efficient, and then using that really efficient system to do a repetitive task feels a little better. But at a certain point, you have to evolve out of that, because your business should be growing, and you as the owner, as the creator, as the driving force, need to move on to more important tasks. And then you're starting to bring people in, and you're hiring people to do those lower level tasks. And then hopefully building them up as well. Like, oh, you're just going to start washing trays, then you'll start filling trays, and then you'll start sewing. They really go through the same steps you went through. And if it doesn't get to that point, if you're always doing all the tray washing and always doing all this and always doing all that, your business model is probably going to fail, because you haven't grown enough, or you don't have enough resources to help you. The way the food peddlers got through repetitive tasks in general was always having multiple people doing a task. It was rare that you worked alone. And there were some tasks that you needed to work alone at. It just didn't make sense to have 2 people. It didn't make it quicker, or there wasn't enough space. And so we had more people working for the co-op than was needed. But that also meant like if I'm doing all the tray packing and sewing and washing and I get sick, the business stops and things collapse very quickly. And so we brought that component into it, and it was good because people would just work part-time, and that worked for them and allowed them to be flexible. That's the thing that really helped buffer the repetitive tasks. Is it was social time, it was catch-up time, it was let's talk about the market, let's plan, or sometimes it was just quiet meditation. But having someone else there really made that viable. So thinking back again, I think people see these businesses as being really independent, but you want to bring other people in as quickly as possible because doing it alone is very, very difficult.
I think if you're doing it and you start to dislike it, that's when you really have to ask yourself, is there a business here? Like, do I want to keep going? And that's a very hard call for some people, because if a business is making money and it's successful and growing, again, I think doing the hard things is easier. If it's the business is iffy or losing money, doing the hard things starts to wear really quickly. And then you need to say, like, is this worth it? Like, I hate cleaning trays. Okay, stop. Should I even be cleaning trays in the first place? Meaning, should I continue to pursue this line of business? Maybe it's an add-on for your farm. And you look at like your bandwidth, your employees' bandwidth, and you just say, we're just not into this segment of the business. We hate the tray filling. We hate the tray washing. What's the gain? Let's just shut it down. And if it's a home-based business where you're starting out, like, I just can't do this. I don't see it growing enough where I can hire somebody to do this. Don't do it. Like, walk away. It's not a fit for everyone. But like you said, if you want to get to that stage where you can bring on other people, have a team approach, have a process in place to mitigate some of these tasks, you have to handle that grunt work early on, which means the business has to be working.
Yeah, that's exactly it. And I'm actually recalling a friend of mine's partner, him and a buddy started a business, developed a product. They go around and they do trade shows to push the product. And really they're hoping for a buyer to buy that product and buy the business. And that's where they're going to make their money. And, they built it, they got to a point, but then it stalled. And, they weren't making any more sales. It was a lot of travel. It was taking them away from their family. And, that buyer wasn't there. And I could just see it eating away at his soul. And it was just like, what am I doing with my life? What am I going to do? Like, we don't really want to sell the business because it's not quite there, or we don't have a buyer. At the same time, it's this dilemma. And at what point do you walk away? And I think it's because a lot of people that are interested in the microgreens at the scale we talk about, it's a pretty small scale. Like there are microgreens companies out there that make in a month, or in a week what the Food Peddlers does in a whole year, right? They're big, big companies. And that's a whole other thing. Like that's just capital investment. You know the market, you work it all out, you spend tons and tons of money. A lot of that is just in finding the market, right? And you produce the stuff. And at that scale, as long as you're doing a fairly decent job, you survive. But you're not a microgreens grower. Then you're an entrepreneur. You're a capitalist in a way, right? People at the smaller scale, don't want a microgreens business for that purpose. But the smaller scale is really, really tough to make a go of it for the reasons we've talked about, right? So it's that scale thing that's a real challenge too, to really understand, and really see where those challenges lie.
Well, you're reading my mind, because that was my number 3 reason of why you shouldn't do this. And it's, you can't sell enough to matter. And I'm going to say this through my context. If I was going to start a business, I don't want to, no disrespect to anybody's microgreen business if it's small. At 20 trays a week, 50 trays a week, kind of like, who cares? Like, what is that doing at the end of the day? When you net out all your costs, all your time, is that paying for my time 40 hours a week or my bills? No. Like, I'd have to be doing 100, 200, 300, 400 trays a week to be significant when I start to look at the math. And that means you have to move, let's say 500 trays a week. You have to sell 500 trays a week. Not everybody's that person. Not everybody has that market. It probably means you're moving to a lot of restaurants, so maybe you're not in that location. There has to be a lot of buyers, grocery stores, a distributor, somebody soaking up the volume. That's not farmers market quantity. And that's just not every market, every location, not everybody's goal. And I think there's a big difference between starting a business because you want to and it's fun, it's a glorified hobby, and starting one that is going to match your life goals. And if you need significant income, especially if you have a partner and kids, like there's no screwing around. You probably need to at least $100,000 in sales by the time you pull out expenses. And then you want to hire an employee. Well, now you probably need to be 150 in sales. Like that's a lot of trays.
Yeah, I've been really pushing with consults and with developing the crop planning spreadsheet. Is you really need to start at about $125,000 in sales a year. So this is Canadian. The numbers may be a little different in U.S. dollars with pricing and whatnot, but yeah, like that's sort of the minimum. And
And what is that trays per week? About 125.
That's a good question. I think about 120 trays per week. Can't remember off the top of my head. You've got to prep me better for questions like that, Diego. But yeah, I think about that, and it depends on what you're growing and what you're pricing it at, right? Like 120 trays of sunflower at 15 or $20 a tray is different than 120 trays of arugula or something that might be double the price because it's a different product. So that does make a difference. And as much success as I feel I had with the food peddlers, I always did other work. And it was set up like I did put a lot of work in the beginning. So I was working a lot of long days and hours. But once the business got going, it was actually a part-time job for me. And so it potentially could have been full-time with another partner, and I could have done 40 hours a week and got everything done in 40 hours a week, but I would have had to do that 40 hours a week every week all the time. And so, as I mentioned, like we had lots of people at the food peddlers there because you had to have time off and you had to have, you couldn't just work all the time. Maybe when you're younger and you're trying to just make a bunch of money for a couple of years, or you can work hard and you can, just take you take a couple of weeks off production. You tell your customers too bad. Like maybe that's viable, but you need to have time away from your business. And so what ends up happening, you're working less in essence because other people are working more. And so you don't make as much money in that regard. The other thing, and this goes into another reason why not to start the business, is you need to work with other people. What my perspective was in the beginning, I'm entrepreneurial. I've got the drive. I'm going to do this. I'm going to hire some people and I'll hire them as I need them. And then I'll hire some other people. But it still left all the responsibility of bookkeeping and marketing and developing systems and all that stuff and management to me. And where things changed was when I took the sole proprietorship, worked with my employees at the time and turned it into a co-op. So I had a team of equals. So someone who liked marketing was doing the marketing, and someone who wanted to do markets was doing it. And so I think key to a good business is having a team of people that you're running it with together. And as you know, working with a team of people can be a challenge. And so if you would rather, be in a pottery studio and spend all day at the wheel making bowls, running a microgreens business with 3 or 4 other people may not be for you either. If you're not interested in going and talking to chefs and selling your product, or going to the farmers market and giving people samples and talking about how great your product is, or if you don't want to be calling up people and saying, hey, your invoice is 60 days overdue because you're not comfortable with people, you definitely do not want to be in microgreens, because it really is. It's one of those things. You are engaging with people all the time. You are selling a consumer product. You need to engage with a lot of people along the way to do that.
Yeah, I think a lot of people can start out as a solopreneur. I mean, you see a lot of videos on YouTube, right? Like how you can start doing microgreens easily, and it's somebody doing it in a room in their house. And then when you kind of know a little bit more, you look around at the setup and you say, okay, well, there's not that much production actually coming out of that system. And then you run the numbers and you say, okay, well, what does this actually get me? I'm taking on a lot of liability. I have this room taking up my house. I'm spending a lot of time to make some side income. Okay, if that fits your context, good. But I don't think that's the audience who's really listening here, or most people that get into this. And people might say, well, I'm going to start this myself. I'm going to do this. But 125 trays a week or $125,000 a year, it's going to, by necessity, evolve into something where you have an employee, at least one, or a business partner involved. And it might be something where you start alone, but you're finishing it with other people. And if you're not entering it thinking, do I want to be a manager someday? You might want to question where you want to go with the business. And that's not an entrepreneurial question that I ask myself. And maybe you could say, well, yeah, you could just grow into it. I'll evolve into that. But some people, they just don't want to do it. Darby on the livestock side, who I do the podcast with, is just doesn't want to manage people. And that's kind of part of his business plan. Like his business is set up to be where him and his family can run it and they don't require outside labor. To do that with microgreens, I just don't see how one person could produce enough to produce a full family's income by themselves. I mean, is it even realistically possible?
Well, I was just reflecting in the winter. I think it was the winter of 2012, where I did just a production system out of my living room. You know, I had taken some time off of other things. I had traveled. And I'm like, oh my shit, like I don't have work. And so I set up this system really quickly in my living room because I had a clientele base I could draw from. And I was doing, I believe, 18 trays twice a week. And it wasn't full time. It was enough time that I could do other things and do that, but it was hard work. And if I had to double that and do more production than that, there's no way I could have kept up with it. So I think it's not the sort of thing you do independently. It's the sort of thing you need to do with someone else. Yeah, some things you can do independently. It makes perfect sense, and you can do it on your own. But growing something like this, because there's so many components to it, really requires a team. And actually, I think with a team of three, if you're energetic, you're younger, you don't have a family, like you know how we talked about family challenges and kids earlier. It's just there's all these things that get in the way on a regular basis. But when you're younger and you've got more energy and more time and more flexibility, yeah, three people running a business could probably do $300,000-$400,000 a year, each working a good 40-hour week, doing several markets. Having some flexibility where some weeks you're working a lot, so someone else can take the time off. But yeah, like your limit for what you can do as an individual, for most people, is going to be very, very capped at a very low number.
Which is a good reason to look at a spreadsheet like you've developed to plan this out, because somebody can sit back and say, here's how much I need to put in the bank per year to cover life and have some savings and not feel like I'm stressing. What does that translate into the business has to do? Can I sell that many trays? And how much work can I realistically do? Because the other thing, it's not just the tray filling that scales up. As you go from, let's say, 20 to 120 trays, like you're hustling to do those sales and communicate with customers. So that goes up tremendously. Like maybe you're just doing a farmer's market. Like, so your customer interaction is kind of all compartmentalized and managed on a Saturday morning. But you 5X that, and now you have 10 chefs. Well, you got a liaison with them. You're trying to find out how their experience is going. Somebody's delivering it. And you're producing, 5 times as much crops. So more work comes just because the business is bigger.
Yeah, it does. And what I've learned is it's understanding how the jump from certain production levels to other production levels affects things. So going from something like, say, $50,000 to $125,000, you end up making a lot of changes there in infrastructure because you're doing there's a lot of things that just become at a bigger scale. You need more bulk things. But going from, say, 125 to 250, you add a delivery person and you're good. You do a little more tray washing. Like it's funny how when you get to those things, once you've got the systems in place, no matter whether you're doing 1 tray or 100 trays, you're still doing your setup, getting everything ready to go, filling things with water. You're still cleaning things when you're done and all that. That doesn't matter. And as you scale up, you do get more efficient. So the trick is to find the sweet spot. So you're working the amount that you want or need to generate the revenue you need to. And I don't know what those numbers are because they really are different for everybody and for every context. And so that's why I like to use the spreadsheet, is because it gives you a sense of what does it look like. And part of the spreadsheet is looking at a labor model and in terms of like, what days am I working or who's doing what? So there's a lot of things to consider in there in terms of scale.
What questions would you ask of a market farmer who's growing field crops and wasn't growing microgreens and wanted to add them on to try and quickly suss out, hey, is this going to be a fit or not?
That's a good question. I think the first thing I'd ask is, like, do you have a production and washing space that can remain that stays and can remain sanitary? Like some farmers, they're fairly basic. They wash their stuff with a hose and they take it to the market and it's fine. But if they have like a good wash station, some storage space, some good covered space, things like that, where they can do the production, that makes it really easy to add it to their system. I would ask them what their time availability is like. Like, are you already at max and are you trying to add another product to your system, and a product that takes a lot of attention because you've got this very narrow window in which to perfect it. You grow a couple hundred row feet of arugula and something goes wrong. Maybe you lose most of the crop, but maybe you can still harvest some of it. Like there's flexibility with field crops that you don't have with microgreens that can affect your capacity to actually deliver by bringing that into your operation. Yeah, I don't know if any those are two things that stand out like off the top of my head. Something else may come to me, but those are two things for sure for adding microgreens to an existing production.
Yeah, so there's a variety of reasons. I think about 6 with a lot of sub bullets to those 6 of why you might not want to start a microgreen operation, or at least additional things to think through and really plan for if you're going to do this. And that's, again, was my goal for this episode, is to say, yeah, I'm excited about this. I want to pursue this. I want to jump in. But before you jump in, wait, think about these things, then decide, okay, do I really want to jump in, or is there something out there that's a better fit for me? And I mean, one of the tools that's came up here a few times is your crop planning software that you have to help people analyze these numbers. If people want to use that to assess adding a microgreen operation onto a market farm, or just think about, can I scale what I have or start something brand new, where's the best place to go to find out more about that crops planning spreadsheet?
Yeah, so the spreadsheet's on my website at urbanmicro.ca. We did a webinar on that crop planner earlier in the year, and I believe, at least I hope, that link is up there as well, so people can sort of watch the webinar to get a sense of what using that spreadsheet looks like. And it does. It allows you to sort of invest a little bit of money and look at some of the numbers, sense of what that looks like, what the potential revenue is, but also being more realistic about what the costs are that are going to come with that. With that investment. I think the other thing, like if I'm going to, be totally self-indulging here, is looking at the workshops that we offer. And that way you're getting a sense of looking at the whole flow of like, okay, what does a week look like? Like, what kind of activities am I going to do? What does that look like? Because I think it's better to spend a couple $100 doing a little bit of training and stuff, as opposed to spending, hundreds of hours of time and research and money and starting it yourself without that. Because if it doesn't work, you've lost a lot more in that regard. So hopefully by the time you're really considering it, it's worth investing a little bit of time and money in getting some training and insight before you jump off on your own.
Maybe for people who don't woof or get experience on another farm, workshops, podcasts like this are a way to decide if it's actually going to work for you. I remember doing a workshop on the livestock side with Darby, and somebody came there thinking they really want to do livestock, and they left the weekend basically saying, hell no, I don't want to do this. I'm going to stick with my current job, which was like insurance sales. And he thought that was a huge success, and so did we. Like, sometimes not starting because you saw what it was really like, what it could be, and you brought reality into this vision you had, is the ultimate success. So spreadsheets, workshops, podcasts like this, conversations like this, thinking like this, conversations with your partner, if it means you don't do microgreens because it's not a fit, I think that's a good thing than wasting time doing it. I mean, maybe there is a better fit for you out there.
No, that's a good point, and it's a great example with the livestock. I have a little bit of interest in livestock, but I'm intimidated by the ongoing, care for animals. Obviously, a lot of the time, livestock is raised for meat, so it's going to be slaughtered. But you actually want to keep a very healthy herd until that time, and that for me, that's intimidating. That's not a knack that I have. And so the idea of livestock, even if the flow of things seems to make sense, that overall care for all these beings' lives it totally intimidates me. And so I know from knowing myself in that way that that's not a place I would go. So the same thing, like microgreens is a little more nebulous because it's like, oh, well, it's just growing microgreens. It's a bunch of seeds and trays. But learning the activities that go with it, I think, is a way of not only getting insight into the business, but hopefully, when you're looking at starting a business like this, whether it's microgreens or livestock or anything, it's part of a process of self-reflection. Like these usually come about because you're making a change in your life. You want to, generate more revenue or have a different lifestyle or do something that's more fulfilling. And it's going to be more than just this looking for this new way to generate revenue. So it's a chance to look at other aspects of your life, and then as you're doing that, you think, yeah, how does this fit into that? So there's some self improvement and self awareness involved, I think.
Well, you're right on the livestock requiring constant care, and I kind of think of microgreens like a livestock in the sense of when it's harvest day, you have to harvest. Maybe you have a little bit of wiggle room. One day before, one day after, you could throw something in a walk-in cooler if you have one to slow it down. But it's not like a tomato that can kind of hang there for a while, or an onion that can sit in the ground, or a carrot. That optimum window is very narrow, and you need to be ready to do it that day, whether you don't feel like it, whether you don't have time for it, whether it's a busy day, whether your kids are a mess that day. It's harvest day, and that's something like for me, like I can't function that way all the time of like I have to be responsible, like dealing with kids and stuff and homeschooling, that makes it challenging for me. So having that, like this has to happen on this day regardless, without that flexibility, that's a challenge, and it's another one of those pieces that goes into that introspective side of things before you start.
Yeah, well, it's funny you say like on harvest day you have to harvest, and while that's true, even more sort of poignant is on sowing day you have to sow. Like that's the one that always got me. It's like, oh, like I have to go and just soak pea seeds tonight. It's the only thing I have to do. I really don't want to do that, but there's nothing else afterwards if you don't do that task. And that's where I always found it difficult, is like I have to start this crop growing. Once it's started, it'll do most of the stuff itself. Like there's very few interactions then, but starting it, that's the hard part. So I can empathize with that one.
That flywheel of the business just keeps spinning and spinning. So a lot of good information in this one. I really hope it helps. I'll link to the spreadsheet, the course below in this one. And if people want to hit you up for more consulting and chat through it, that's something you also offer.
Definitely. But yeah, hopefully this podcast gives people a lot of insight that, be great if you want to do a consult, but if you can figure the stuff out on your own, and if you think it's going to work or not, you can make your decisions from there.
There you have it, Chris and I on the many, many reasons why microgreens aren't right for you. I hope after hearing this episode makes a lot of sense. I hope it fills in a lot of gaps around the microgreen information out there. They aren't just a panacea. They aren't a silver bullet to your financial woes and your farm's woes. There are actually cons to doing this type of business. Like any business. If after listening to this, you decide that microgreens are right for you, and you're looking to learn more about the business of microgreens, check out Chris's Growing Your Microgreens business course, which I've linked to in the show notes for this one below. That course covers everything that you need to know about starting a microgreen business. From soils to production to sales, it's an extensive course taught by someone who did this for over 10 years. It's a perfect fit for anybody looking to start a microgreen business or somebody who's kind of dabbled in microgreens and feels like they're spinning their wheels a little bit. You can learn more about the course and register using the link in the notes below. That's all for this one. Thanks for listening. Until next time, be nice, be thankful, and do the work.